Amelia's words, they weren't just spoken, they were hurled, each one a stone meant to bruise. "You're too poor, Clara." An embarrassment, really, to stand beside me. We were in her pristine living room, all cream and beige. A room that always felt like it was holding its breath, afraid a speck of dust might mar its perfection. My own small apartment, filled with books and the scent of herbs, felt miles away, a different world entirely. She was planning her wedding, the wedding she'd dreamed of since we were girls, playing dress-up with our mother's old scarves. I was to be her maid of honor. That was the plan, unspoken but assumed, like the roots of an old tree that bind the earth beneath. But roots, I was learning, could be severed with a sharp enough blade. She held a guest list in one hand, a pen in the other, tapping it against a gilded invitation as if punctuating her decree. An embarrassment. The word echoed in the sterile space, bounced off the polished surfaces, and settled deep within me, cold and heavy. I looked at her, my younger sister, her face flushed with the excitement of bridal plans and, perhaps, a touch of something less becoming, a disdain she barely bothered to conceal. Was this what we had become? Two strangers separated by a chasm of perceived status. My clothes, always neat but mended. My hands, calloused from kneading dough for the small bakery I ran from my kitchen. These were the markers of my poverty in her eyes. She saw not the resilience, the quiet dignity of making a life on my own terms, but only the lack of shine, of disposable income, of the superficial gloss she equated with worth. I remember the silence that followed her pronouncement. It was a thick, suffocating blanket. What could I say? To argue would be to validate the premise. To plead would be to diminish myself further. So, I simply nodded. A small, almost imperceptible movement. A door had slammed shut, a heavy, ornate door, and I was on the outside. The garden we had once shared, full of whispered secrets and childish laughter, now felt like it belonged to her alone, and I was merely a weed to be plucked. She mistook my silence for acquiescence, perhaps even shame. She turned back to her lists, dismissing me with a flick of her wrist. Already moving on to the next item on her agenda. The seating chart. The floral arrangements. I was a problem solved, a potential blemish on her perfect day, neatly erased. I walked out of her house that afternoon, the sun feeling too bright, the world too loud. The stones she had thrown, they didn't just bruise. They settled into the soft earth of my spirit, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me, that something would have to grow from them. Not bitterness, I hoped, but something stronger, something rooted in the very soil she had deemed barren. Something that would, in its own time, bloom. The echo of an embarrassment followed me home, a persistent shadow clinging to my steps. It whispered from the corners of my small kitchen, rustled in the leaves of the basil plant on my windowsill, settled into the worn fabric of my armchair. For days, I moved through my life as if wading through water, every action requiring an effort that felt monumental. The scent of baking bread, usually a comfort, now seemed to mock me with its simple honesty. Amelia's judgment had cast a pall over everything, turning familiar comforts into reminders of my perceived inadequacy. I replayed her words, her dismissive gesture, the cool certainty in her eyes. Was it true? Was my life, lived with care and a quiet joy I had cultivated, truly something to be ashamed of? I looked around my tiny apartment, at the mismatched teacups I'd collected, the colorful woven rug a friend had gifted me, the shelves overflowing with books that were my dearest companions. It wasn't a palace, certainly not by Amelia's standards. There were no gilded edges, no sterile perfection. But it was mine. It was a haven built with my own hands, filled with the echoes of my own laughter, my own quiet contemplations. Yet, her words had found a crack, a tiny fissure of self-doubt I hadn't known existed, and prized it open. The initial sting, sharp and visceral, began to transform into something else. A cold resolve started to crystallize within me. It wasn't about proving Amelia wrong. Not entirely. It was about proving something to myself. That my worth wasn't tied to the balance in my bank account or the labels on my clothes. That the soil she saw as barren could, indeed, nurture something extraordinary. I thought of our grandmother, a woman who could make beauty from scraps, who saw potential where others saw none. She used to say, "Clara, child, the richest lives are not always the shiniest." Her wisdom, a gentle melody from my childhood, began to play softly in my mind, a counterpoint to Amelia's harsh pronouncement. The idea didn't come in a flash of lightning, no dramatic epiphany. It was a slow dawning, like the sun rising on a misty morning. A need to build, to create something tangible that reflected not my circumstances, but my spirit. The world saw me as small, insignificant. Perhaps it was time to redefine what small could achieve. The seeds of change weren't sown in anger, though anger was there, a simmering ember. They were sown in a quiet determination, a decision to reclaim the narrative of my own life. Amelia had slammed a door, yes, but in doing so, she had inadvertently pointed me towards another, one I hadn't even realized was there, waiting to be opened. And I knew, with a certainty that was beginning to warm me from the inside out, that I would find the key. The key, as it turned out, was tucked away in the most unexpected of places. Not in grand schemes or daring ventures, but in the quiet hum of local artistry, in the scent of beeswax and drying herbs, in the patient hands of craftspeople Amelia would likely never notice. I remembered a small cooperative, the Artisan's Route. I'd read about in a local paper months ago. They were a collective of weavers, potters, woodworkers, and herbalists, pooling their talents but struggling with the business side of things. Their creations were beautiful, infused with a sense of place and history, but they lacked visibility, a bridge to a wider world. They were, in a way, like me, their value unseen, their potential unacknowledged by the bustling marketplace that prized gloss over substance. The name itself, the Artisan's Route, resonated with the feeling that had taken hold of me, that need to connect with something fundamental, something growing from the earth. I visited them on a crisp autumn afternoon. Their workshop was housed in an old converted mill, a building with character etched into its stone walls, much like the faces of the artisans themselves. There was Martha, her fingers gnarled but nimble as she worked the loom, coaxing intricate patterns from threads of homespun wool. There was Samuel, his hands caked with clay, spinning bowls that seemed to hold the very curve of the earth. And Alara, her small shop smelling of lavender and chamomile, her herbal remedies a testament to ancient knowledge. They were passionate, dedicated, but their ledgers told a story of struggle. They spoke of dwindling orders, of the difficulty competing with mass-produced goods. They were a garden on the verge of withering, their roots starved for nourishment. I listened, not as a potential customer, but as someone who understood the ache of being undervalued. I saw not just their present difficulties, but the deep, untapped well of their talent. What if, I thought, what if their roots could find new soil, richer soil? My small savings, carefully hoarded from my bakery earnings, wouldn't buy me entry into Amelia's world of gilded invitations. But perhaps it could be a lifeline here. It was a risk, a significant one. The money was my safety net, the buffer against the precariousness of a life lived on a modest income. To invest it in a struggling cooperative felt like stepping off a cliff. But the alternative, to let Amelia's definition of me stand, to wither in the shadow of her disdain, felt like a slower, more certain demise. I spent weeks with them, learning, observing. I tasted Alara's tisanes, felt the weight of Samuel's pottery, admired the intricate beauty of Martha's weaving. I saw not just products, but stories. Stories of tradition, of skill, passed down through generations, of a connection to the land that was becoming increasingly rare. And I began to see a path, a way to bring these stories to light. It wasn't about charity. It was about partnership. It was about believing in the intrinsic worth of what they created, a worth that transcended fleeting trends and superficial judgments. The decision, when it came, felt less like a leap of faith and more like a quiet homecoming. This was where my small resources could make a difference. This was a garden I could help tend, a place where roots could deepen and flourish. The investment was made, a quiet transaction, no fanfare, no announcements, just a handshake with Martha, whose eyes, the color of faded denim, held a flicker of renewed hope. My savings, which had seemed so meager in the face of Amelia's impending extravaganza, now felt potent, a seed planted with intention. The early days were a lesson in patience, a slow, deliberate tending. I didn't abandon my small bakery. Its familiar rhythms, the warmth of the oven, the scent of yeast, kept me grounded. But my evenings, and any spare moment I could find, were dedicated to the artisan's route. I learned about marketing, not the aggressive, shouting kind, but the storytelling kind. I helped them create a simple website, photographing their wares in the soft light of the old mill, writing descriptions that spoke of the hands that made them, the traditions they embodied. We started small, local craft fairs, farmers' markets. Sometimes we sold very little, a few pots, a handful of herbal sachets. There were days doubt gnawed at me, the echo of Amelia's embarrassment resurfacing. Was I pouring my life into a dream that would never take flight? Was this just another form of my perceived inadequacy, a grand gesture leading nowhere? But then there would be a small win, a customer whose eyes lit up at the sight of Martha's woven shawls. An email from someone miles away who had stumbled upon our website and wanted to order a set of Samuel's bowls. These were the drops of rain on parched earth, signs that life was stirring beneath the surface. I learned to read ledgers, to manage inventory, skills I never imagined I would possess. I discovered a shrewdness I hadn't known was in me, a quiet determination to make this work, not just for myself, but for Martha, Samuel, Alara, and the others who had entrusted their hopes to this shared venture. We faced setbacks, a large order cancelled at the last minute, a crucial piece of equipment breaking down. Each challenge felt like a personal blow, but each one overcome strengthened our collective resolve. We were a small, unassuming sapling, buffeted by winds, but our roots were slowly, tenaciously taking hold. The work was often invisible, unglamorous. Long hours spent packing boxes, wrestling with shipping logistics, answering customer inquiries with a patience I sometimes had to dig deep to find. There was no applause, no external validation, just the quiet satisfaction of seeing a well-crafted piece find a home, of knowing that we were building something of value, something real. Amelia, I knew, was immersed in a whirlwind of wedding preparations, of choosing caterers and florists, of fittings for a dress that probably cost more than my entire annual income. Our worlds had diverged so completely, it felt as if we lived on different planets. Hers, glittering and loud. Mine, quiet and steadily growing, like a hidden garden. And in that quiet growth, I found a resilience, I never knew I possessed. Years slipped by, measured not in dramatic events, but in the steady rhythm of seasons, in the slow, organic growth of the artisan's root. What began as a fragile hope, a quiet act of defiance, had begun to flourish in ways I hadn't dared to imagine. Our little cooperative, once struggling for air, found its breath. Then it found its voice. It started with a small feature in a niche design magazine, then another. Bloggers discovered us. Suddenly, the unique, handcrafted quality that had once been our obscurity became our strength. People were tired of the mass-produced, the soulless. They craved authenticity, the touch of human hands, the story behind the object. And we had stories to tell, woven into every thread, molded into every curve, infused into every scent. Orders began to flow, not just locally, but nationally, then internationally. The old mill, once echoing with a few dedicated artisans, now hummed with a quiet, purposeful energy. We hired more people from the community, revitalizing skills that had been dormant. Martha trained younger weavers. Samuel took on apprentices. Ilara's herb garden expanded, its fragrance drifting through the open windows. My role evolved. I was no longer just helping with marketing. I was a partner, a strategist, helping to guide our growth while preserving the integrity of our craft. The profits, modest at first, grew steadily, then remarkably. My initial investment, that carefully saved sum that had felt like my entire world, had multiplied many times over. I could have bought a house like Amelia's, filled it with cream and beige, but the thought held no appeal. My small apartment, now comfortably furnished, still filled with books and the scent of herbs, remained my sanctuary. The change was more internal. A quiet confidence had settled into my bones, a sense of self-possession that no amount of money could buy and no amount of scorn could erode. I still baked, though less for income and more for the joy of it, sharing loaves with friends and the artisans at the mill. I learned about art, about sustainable business practices, about the quiet power of community. I traveled, not to lavish resorts, but to meet other artisans, to learn about different traditions, to find inspiration for the artisan's root. I never spoke of my success to Amelia, or to any of my family. What was there to say? How could I explain this journey, this quiet transformation, to those who measured worth in such different currency? The distance between us had become a vast, silent ocean. Sometimes I wondered if Amelia ever thought of me, of her dismissive words. Did she imagine me still struggling, still an embarrassment? The thought brought not triumph, but a faint, lingering sadness for the sister I had lost. Or perhaps the sister I had never truly known. The garden I tended now was vast, its roots deep and widespread, its blossoms vibrant, and I, its quiet gardener, was content. Then, one crisp spring morning, an envelope lay on my doormat. Thick, creamy cardstock, an elegant, looping script. Amelia's wedding invitation. It felt like a relic from a forgotten era, a voice from a distant past. Years had passed since her cruel dismissal. 5, perhaps 6. I had lost count, not because the wound had vanished entirely, but because my life had become so much larger than that single, painful moment. The artisan's root was now a recognized name, synonymous with quality and ethical craftsmanship. We had won awards. Our pieces were featured in galleries, in homes around the world. My own life had a quiet abundance I cherished. The invitation sat on my kitchen table for days, a silent summons. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to simply let it fade into the background of my busy, fulfilling life. Why revisit that old pain? Why step back into a world where I had been judged so harshly? But another part of me, a quieter, more insistent voice, urged me to go. Not for revenge, not to flaunt my success. That felt hollow, a betrayal of the very principles I had come to live by. But perhaps for closure, perhaps to stand in that space, not as the person Amelia had dismissed, but as the woman I had become, to see her, to see them all with new eyes. Could I do it? Could I face her, her world, without the old hurt flaring up, without feeling that familiar sting of inadequacy? I thought of the journey, the quiet, patient work, the community we had built. I thought of Martha's steady gaze, Samuel's earthy laugh, Alara's gentle wisdom. They were my true north, my anchors. I wasn't the same woman who had walked out of Amelia's pristine living room, shattered and small. The roots I had cultivated, both for myself and for the artisan's root, were deep and strong now. They could withstand a storm, or even the chilly indifference of a world that valued tinsel over gold. The question wasn't whether I could go, but whether I should. Would it serve any purpose beyond stirring up old ghosts? Or was it an opportunity, not to prove her wrong, but to affirm to myself how far I had come? To stand tall, not in defiance, but in quiet dignity. The words, an embarrassment, still echoed faintly, but they had lost their power to wound. They were just words, empty shells. My worth was no longer a question to be debated. It was a quiet certainty, a bedrock beneath my feet. The decision, when it finally came, felt less like a choice and more like an inevitable unfolding. Yes, I would go. Not for Amelia, not even for the Clara of the past, but for the Clara I was now. A woman who understood that true wealth isn't about what you possess, but about what you cultivate, what you build, and the quiet strength you find within yourself. The preparation for Amelia's wedding was an exercise in quiet intention. It wasn't about outshining anyone. Certainly not my sister on her day. That kind of victory would be empty, a hollow echo of the values she herself seemed to champion. No. This was about representing myself, the woman I had become, with honesty and grace. I thought about what to wear. Amelia's world was one of labels, of visible expense. My world was one of craftsmanship, of understated elegance, of materials that spoke of quality rather than shouting for attention. I chose a dress not from a high-end boutique, but commissioned from a young designer whose work I admired, someone who, like the artisan's root in its early days, was full of talent yet to be widely recognized. The fabric was a deep forest green, the color of moss and ancient trees. A silk so fine it felt like water against the skin. Its cut was simple, timeless, relying on the beauty of the material and the skill of the maker rather than on embellishment. It was a quiet statement, one I hoped Amelia, in her world of glitter, might not even understand. My only jewelry was a piece from our own cooperative, a necklace of brushed silver, designed by a new artisan we were mentoring, its pendant shaped like an unfurling fern, a symbol of growth and resilience. It was a piece that held meaning, a story. The shoes were comfortable, elegant, made by a traditional cobbler I'd met on my travels. Every item was chosen with care, reflecting the values I had come to embody: quality, artistry, and a quiet disregard for fleeting trends. As I dressed on the morning of the wedding, I caught my reflection in the mirror. The face looking back was older. Yes, lines etched by time and experience. but the eyes were clear, steady. There was a calmness there that hadn't existed 6 years ago. The anxiety, the self-doubt that had once plagued me had receded, replaced by a quiet self-assurance. I wasn't trying to be someone else. I was simply, finally, comfortable being myself. Driving to the venue, an opulent country estate Amelia had chosen, I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were an observer about to witness a play. The old hurt was a faint hum in the background, but it no longer dictated my emotions. My heart was steady. I thought of the journey that had brought me here, the countless hours, the small victories, the quiet satisfaction of building something meaningful. That was my armor, my strength. It wasn't about the money I now had, though that provided a certain freedom. It was about the journey itself, the person I had become through it. Would Amelia see it? Would anyone? Perhaps not. But it didn't matter. I saw it. And that, I realized, was enough. The gates of the estate loomed ornate and imposing. This was her world, the world she had chosen. I was merely a visitor, passing through. But I was no longer the poor relation, the embarrassing sister. I was Clara, a woman who had found her own path, cultivated her own garden. And it was a garden, I knew, far richer than Amelia could ever have imagined. The gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled into the manicured driveway of the estate. Valets in crisp uniforms rushed forward, their eyes widening slightly at the understated elegance of my older but impeccably maintained car, a quiet classic, another reflection of my taste for enduring quality over flashy novelty. I handed the keys over with a polite smile and stepped out, the forest green silk of my dress whispering around me. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and hothouse flowers. Guests in their finest attire were already milling about, a sea of pastel silks and dark suits. I felt a momentary flicker, a shadow of the old unease, but it passed quickly, like a cloud drifting across the sun. I was an observer here, not a supplicant. I walked towards the entrance, my gaze sweeping over the scene, taking in the grandeur, the almost frantic efforts at perfection. It was beautiful, undoubtedly, but it also felt staged, like a meticulously crafted illusion. And then I saw her, Amelia. She was standing near the grand staircase, a vision in white, surrounded by a coterie of bridesmaids in blush pink. She was radiant, of course, every inch the perfect bride. Her eyes, however, were scanning the arriving guests with a kind of nervous intensity. Our eyes met. For a fraction of a second, I saw confusion flicker across her face, a momentary lapse in her bridal composure. Then, recognition dawned, followed by an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Was it surprise? Disbelief? Or something else? She hadn't expected me, I realized. Or perhaps she hadn't expected this version of me. The woman standing before her was not the downcast, apologetic sister she had dismissed years ago. This woman stood tall, her gaze direct, her presence imbued with a quiet confidence that needed no external validation. I offered a small, polite smile. No triumph, no accusation. Just a simple acknowledgement. Her own smile faltered, became brittle. One of her bridesmaids, noticing the exchange, whispered something to her. Amelia's attention snapped back to her bridal duties, but I saw her glance my way again, a quick, furtive look. The word embarrassment echoed in my mind, but this time it was accompanied by a profound sense of irony. The tables, it seemed, had turned, though not in a way I had ever plotted or desired. I didn't approach her. The chasm between us was too wide, too deep to be bridged by polite wedding chatter. I found a quiet spot, a little removed from the main throng, and simply observed. The opulence was staggering. Champagne flowed like water. A string quartet played Vivaldi. It was everything Amelia had ever dreamed of, a perfect tableau of success and status. But as I watched her, I saw a flicker of something else in her eyes, a tension, a strain, as if she were desperately trying to hold on to this perfect image. It was a bittersweet moment, seeing her achieve her dream, yet sensing the fragility beneath the glittering surface. My presence, I knew, was an unexpected note in her carefully orchestrated symphony, a quiet disruption. And that, perhaps, was the most potent statement of all. Throughout the ceremony and the early part of the reception, I remained a quiet observer. I saw my parents, who greeted me with a warmth that felt genuine, though tinged with a slight, unspoken surprise at my presence, and perhaps my visible composure. They asked polite questions about my life, and I answered vaguely, speaking of my business, doing well, without offering details. They seemed content with that, perhaps relieved that I wasn't making a scene, that I wasn't the embarrassment Amelia had feared. I saw other relatives, distant cousins, old family friends. Some nodded curtly, their memories of me likely fixed in that earlier, poorer version. Others offered hesitant smiles, perhaps sensing a change they couldn't quite articulate. It was Amelia, however, whose reactions I noted with a detached sort of curiosity. She was the radiant bride, laughing, posing for photographs, the star of her own carefully produced show. Yet, her eyes kept finding mine across the crowded room. There was a new expression in them now, a kind of bewildered assessment. She was looking at my dress, the simple elegance of it, the quiet richness of the fabric. She was looking at the understated silver fern at my throat, a piece that spoke of artistry rather than ostentation. She was, I suspected, trying to place me, to understand how the sister she had written off could now move with such quiet assurance in this opulent setting. Once, during a lull in the festivities, she found herself near me, almost by accident. Her husband, a man who looked successful and slightly overwhelmed, was at her side. He smiled politely. Amelia's smile was strained. "Clara," she said, her voice a little too bright. "You came?" "Of course, Amelia," I replied, my tone even calm. "It's a beautiful wedding." Her eyes flickered over me again, a quick, appraising glance. "You look well," she finally managed, as if the words themselves were a surprise to her. "Thank you," I said. "I am well." There was a beat of silence, filled with unspoken things, with years of distance and misunderstanding. What did she expect? An apology? A plea for forgiveness for my past poverty? Or perhaps an explanation for my present poise? I offered none. My life, my journey, was not for her dissection or approval. A well-meaning aunt, noticing us, bustled over. "Amelia, darling, and Clara, so lovely to see you both. Clara, dear, you're looking so prosperous. What is it you do these days? Still that little bakery?" Before I could answer, Amelia interjected, a touch too quickly. "Oh, Clara has her little projects." The condescension was still there. Fainter, perhaps, but unmistakable. But this time, it didn't sting. I merely smiled. "Actually," I said, my voice quiet but clear, "my main project, the Artisan's Route, has become quite successful. We work with artisans nationally, and we've recently expanded into international markets. It keeps me very busy." I saw a flicker of something in Amelia's eyes. Surprise, definitely. And perhaps, for the first time, a dawning awareness that she had profoundly misjudged me, misjudged the quiet waters that ran so deep. The aunt looked impressed. Amelia just looked stunned. The moment passed. She was swept away by her duties as a bride. But something had shifted. A small, almost invisible crack had appeared in the wall of her certainty. The rest of the evening unfolded in a series of similar, subtle moments. I didn't seek them out, but they found me. An old family friend, a businessman himself, overheard someone mention the artisan's route in connection with my name. He approached me later, his expression intrigued. Clara? Are you the Clara behind the artisan's route? My wife adores your ceramics. We had no idea. He spoke of our reputation for quality, for ethical sourcing. He asked insightful questions about our business model. We had a brief, engaging conversation about the challenges and rewards of building a brand based on authenticity. Amelia, who happened to be nearby, caught snippets of our exchange. I saw her pause, her smile freezing for a moment as she registered the respect in the businessman's tone, the nature of our discussion. It wasn't about little projects anymore. Later, a younger cousin, someone who had always been kind, asked me about the fern necklace I wore. I told her about the artisan who designed it, about our cooperative's mission to support emerging talent. Her eyes lit up with genuine interest. That's incredible, Clara. It's beautiful, and the story behind it makes it even more so. She touched it gently, admiringly. These weren't grand pronouncements of wealth or status. They were quiet affirmations of the life I had built, of the values I held. It wasn't about the money, though the success of the artisan's route had certainly brought financial security far beyond anything Amelia could have imagined for me. It was about the purpose, the creativity, the community. These were the true riches, the ones that couldn't be bought or flaunted, only cultivated. As the evening wore on, I saw Amelia watching me more often. The bewilderment in her eyes was deepening. The carefully constructed world she had built, where worth was measured by external markers, was being subtly challenged by my mere presence, by the quiet dignity that emanated from a life lived authentically. She had expected an embarrassment, a reminder of what she had risen above. Instead, she found a woman who was, in her own way, far more rooted, far more genuinely prosperous than she might ever be. The irony was not lost on me. She had cast me out for being too poor. But in doing so, she had pushed me towards a path that led to a richness she couldn't comprehend, a richness of spirit, of purpose, of self. There was no gloating in this realization, only a profound, bittersweet understanding of the strange and winding paths our lives can take. The music played on, the champagne continued to flow, but for me, the true spectacle was the unfolding of this quiet, internal drama, the subtle rebalancing of scales that had been tipped unfairly for so long. My revenge, if it could be called that, was not in outshining her, but in simply being, authentically and unapologetically, myself. As the night drew to a close, I found myself standing by a window, looking out at the moonlit gardens. The music had softened, the laughter had become more subdued. I felt a sense of peace, a quiet completion. I hadn't come seeking apology or acknowledgement from Amelia. I had come for myself, to close a chapter, to affirm my own journey, and that I had achieved. Amelia approached me, her bridal gown shimmering in the soft light. The earlier strain on her face had been replaced by a weary sort of thoughtfulness. She stood beside me, also looking out at the garden. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't hostile, as it had been years ago in her pristine living room. It was laden. "Clara," she began, her voice softer now, stripped of its earlier brittle edge. I didn't realize." "Realize what?" I wondered. The extent of my financial success? That I was no longer the person she had dismissed? Or perhaps something deeper? I didn't prompt her. I simply waited. "Your business," she continued hesitantly. "It sounds significant." "It is," I replied quietly. It's brought a lot of good to many people, myself included. You seem different, she said, almost to herself. I am, I agreed. Time changes us. Experiences shape us. She turned to me then, her eyes searching mine. Was I very cruel? She asked, the question so soft it was almost a whisper. It was the closest she would come to an apology, I knew. And in that moment, the last vestiges of the old hurt seemed to dissolve. You said what you believed at the time, Amelia, I said, choosing my words carefully. It was painful, yes, but in a way, it set me on a path I might never have found otherwise. Was it forgiveness? Perhaps. Or maybe it was simply an acknowledgement of the complex, often unintentional ways our lives impact one another. The roots of our shared past were tangled, some nourishing, some strangling. But new roots had grown, strong and independent. She looked down at her hands, at the glittering rings on her finger. My world, she said, a hint of something I couldn't quite name in her voice. It's all about appearances. Mine is about substance, I replied gently. Not a judgment. Just a statement of fact. She nodded slowly. I think, she said, a dawning understanding in her eyes, I think you might be richer than I ever imagined. And there it was. Not in the way the world measures riches, perhaps, but in the ways that truly mattered. In resilience. In purpose. In the quiet dignity of a life well lived. On one's own terms. I smiled. A genuine, unburdened smile. Perhaps I am, Amelia. Perhaps I am. I didn't stay for the final farewells. I slipped away quietly, leaving Amelia to her glittering world, to the life she had chosen. As I drove away from the grand estate, under the silent gaze of the moon, I felt no triumph, no lingering bitterness, only a sense of peace and a quiet gratitude for the unexpected journey that had led me from the sting of an embarrassment to the profound, enduring wealth of self-acceptance. The road ahead was my own, and it stretched out before me, full of promise, illuminated by the quiet light of my own making.